All right. The judge then deciding, sorry about the bouncing ball there, but the judge deciding after instructing the jury to go home for the weekend that their big work would begin on Monday. He had a brief conversation with the lawyers and specifically with Derek Chauvin, the defendant. Let's bring back Laura Coates and Chief Charles Ramsey. Laura, the judge there, we're at a very important procedural matter, and it's sort of the housekeeping matters, but critical housekeeping matters. That you'll have the closing arguments on Monday. You'll have the judge's instructions to the jury about the law, what they should and should not consider, and then inevitably questions come up from the jury, and the judge is trying to walk through there. This will be done in this COVID era. It'll be done by Zoom. Just telling Mr. Chauvin you need to be available. You don't need to be in the courtroom every day, but you need to be available to us if we need you.
And most importantly here, the jurors are now going to be sequestered following closing arguments for the duration of deliberations. They were told to pack for a long time, but hope for a shorter amount of time, taking into consideration that we've had 3 weeks now of testimony. But of course, the most memorable testimony is going to be what drives the jurors' decisions here. And the prosecution is going to have to do a phenomenal job in the closing arguments of really threading through all of the different aspects of this trial, using that star witness at the 9-minute and 29-second video, hearing from George Floyd himself, who although has now died, is still going to have his voice loom very large over this entire thing. His statements about not being able to breathe, the silence after he lost consciousness, the statements of the bystanders, the law enforcement officials who testified, and of course the last person we heard from was the dynamite pulmonology expert who also gave great testimony in the prosecution's case. If you balance that as a jury around this 3-day weekend, John, and now also what sticks in your mind, it's the prosecution's case that had those moments. The defense case, really not memorable to move the needle. So you got to wonder how the defense at their closing is going to try to undermine at their final bite at the apple all the things the prosecution was able to accomplish in this trial.
And the most dramatic things that happened today, the most significant things from a rule of law perspective or how the trial would go forward perspective, happened with the jury, not in the courtroom. And that happened in the pretrial session this morning, Chief. And let's start with the defendant's decision. It is his constitutional right. If you are on trial in the United States of America, you do not have to testify at your own trial. The burden is on the prosecution. We did not expect Derek Chauvin to testify, but you never know until the end. And so in the courtroom this morning, first a conversation back and forth between Mr. Nelson, his attorney, and Mr. Chauvin, proving to the judge that they had discussed this issue many, many times because of the defendant's rights. And then Officer Chauvin talking directly to Judge Cahill about his decision not to testify. Listen.
Is this your decision not to testify?
It is, Your Honor.
All right. Do you have any questions about your right to remain silent or to testify on your own behalf?
Not at this time, I don't.
All right. Does anyone promise anything or threaten you in any way to keep you from testifying?
No promises or threats, Your Honor.
Do you feel that your decision not to testify is a voluntary one on your behalf?
Yes, it is.
The judge then accepts that, the defendant's right not to testify. I want to hear both of your thoughts on this. Let's start with you, Chief Ramsey. And I heard you earlier in the day saying this was, you expected this the case because if Derek Chauvin gets on that stand, he is open to everything.
Exactly right. And that would put him in a terrible position and would, I think, go a long way toward him losing the case as opposed to even having a slight chance of winning. I mean, there's no justification for what he did. And I believe, having watched the prosecution now for the last 3 weeks and how skillful they are at questioning witnesses, they would literally rip him to shreds. And so I'm not surprised he's not going to testify. I think it's in his best interest that he doesn't testify. And so the only surprise would be if he said he was. So I think he made a good decision for himself.
And to that point, Laura, the potential value, we've heard the defense theory throughout, right, that they are trying to make the case that there was a struggle beforehand. Officer Chauvin thought George Floyd might struggle again. He knew he was under the influence of controlled substances. He was worried about that. At one point, Mr. Nelson has said repeatedly, Officer Chauvin was starting to get worried about the crowd, and was he under threat from the crowd, and maybe he became distracted and wasn't paying attention to Mr. Floyd's care and health. To hear Officer Chauvin's perspective, there could potentially be helpful to the defense. The problem is, then the prosecution can say, you went to all of your training, right, where you were told not to do these things, right? You agree?
Absolutely. They've contemplated all of the different flowchart analysis here. If he were to say, look, I thought I was following my training. Well, we've heard multiple witnesses who've said this was not the training. In fact, you were trained the opposite. If he says, well, I had no idea he was under physical duress. Well, we've seen from the video with our own eyes, and the jury has seen as well, 9 minutes and 29 seconds worth of having this person be at least under physical duress for the last 4 minutes or so, no longer being conscious, and bystanders calling out, imploring him to do something. He could also say, I waited for medical personnel to arrive before rendering aid. Well, we know that if you're in the police custody, you have a duty of care owed to provide and render CPR or other services, even if you don't think you were the cause of the physical duress. And finally, the idea of saying, well, look, the crowd was so distracting to me, I couldn't possibly have performed my duty here. Well, the EMTs arrived and they were able to be nimble around this very thing. So when you kind of go through and walk through the potential responses he could give, all he's left with essentially is trying to appeal to one or more jurors to say, look, I made a mistake. I didn't mean to. It could have been you. This could have happened to anyone. Then again, you have other officers on the scene and other people looking at this and saying, no, what would it have taken to move off this person's neck? And again, the final thing that normally is what officers get for the benefit of the doubt is the idea of having to make split-second decisions, John. They don't want you to have the Monday morning quarterback and use your 20/20 hindsight to now judge a split-second decision. Think of how the prosecution started this case. 9 minutes and 29 seconds and not a split second among them. This was contemplative. How will he answer that? It was a good decision, although the prosecutor and me would love to have seen him be cross-examined on all these things. It was probably a prudent decision for him to stay off of that stand.
But the other dramatic thing this morning, and your eyes always pop when you know it's the day the defense is going to rest. You know you're getting to the point where you're at the end of the trial, and at the pretrial hearing this morning, you hear the words newly discovered evidence. That is a shock at any point in the trial, but especially right at the end of the trial. And what the prosecution was telling the judge is when the defense expert, a medical doctor, testified yesterday, he was raising these theories about carbon monoxide, potential carbon monoxide poisoning in George Floyd, that the medical examiner went back and looked through the records and says, oh, we found a test that directly refutes what that expert witness said. So the judge this morning said, sorry. You were warned this theory, you were warned months ago. This theory might be raised by the defense medical experts. You should have looked then to find the test. And listen here when the judge said very clearly, any mention of this, and this is a mistrial.
The late disclosure has prejudiced the defense. It's not going to be allowed. So Dr. Tobin will not be allowed to testify as to those lab results. If there's anything he wished to add about carbon monoxide as far as environmental factors, but if he even hints that there are test results that the jury has not heard about, it's going to be a mistrial. Pure and simple. This late disclosure is not the way we should be operating here.
Chief, that was a back-in-your-chair moment in the sense that the prosecution wanted to bring in the test result that said George Floyd's carbon monoxide level was 1.5%. They've had that evidence for months. They've had that evidence since May. The blood was drawn back after Mr. Floyd was killed in May. The prosecution wanted to bring that in to say to the jury, essentially, pay no attention to Dr. Fowler because what he said is a cockamamie theory, and we have the evidence to prove it wrong. But the judge said, no, you should have done your homework back in February and March and April as we were moving through the pretrial process. You can't bring it in.
And the judge is absolutely right. I mean, for the first time in 3 weeks, we actually saw the prosecution actually on its heels a bit during that discussion. With a case like this, a high-profile case like this, you would think that every single analysis would be conducted and that it would be thoroughly reviewed by the prosecution. And if they had that information, then they should have brought it forward, especially since the defense did raise it with Dr. Fowler, where he raised that issue, and on cross-examination, the prosecution pretty much poo-pooed it as if, it was just foolish to even raise that particular issue. And so, they were walking a real tightrope there with the rebuttal witness, Dr. Tobin, because if he had messed up, this would have been a mistrial, and that would have had huge ramifications beyond the courtroom.
And to that point, Laura, as a former prosecutor, the prosecution, the state of Minnesota, decided we're going to do it. We're going to bring Dr. Tobin back into the room because there is a test A that mostly makes the point. They wanted to bring in test B, which directly refutes the testimony of Dr. Fowler. The judge said, don't touch test B. Do not touch test B. So they bring in the witness, and a trained lawyer knows I cannot say this, but I heard you speaking earlier about what about the witness. Witnesses can sometimes just start to talk. Listen to Dr. Tobin, and then on the other side a question.
We know in Mr. Floyd that it was 98% saturated.
So 98% saturated with oxygen?
With oxygen when they measured it in Hennepin County.
So in other words, as to the statement that his carboxyhemoglobin could have increased by 10 to 18%, in your view, that's not possible?
It's simply wrong.
And it was at most 2%?
At most 2%.
Again, they have a test that says it was 1.5%. He just could not say that. So you're walking up to the line, and if, as an attorney, you're holding your breath, asking the witness, please don't cross the line. Get right up to the edge, but don't cross. Did he do it?
He did it, and this was kind of an evidentiary thesaurus of sorts, right? I can't mention this. What else can I use to describe this? I'll use what's already in evidence, these oxygen-related data, to draw the inference of, look, this must be true. If this is the oxygen level, then the carbon monoxide level must be X, without actually putting your hand on that hot stove. But I tell you, prosecutors always know you never want to ask that one question too many because you invite already very chatty Cathy witnesses, whether they're talking about a level of expertise or otherwise. Expert witnesses want to provide testimony. They want to speak. And this particular witness as well sat on the stand for hours, and they asked him, why did you come to testify initially? And he said, well, I was asked and thought it could be helpful, and he volunteered his services. This is a red flag for prosecutors to know this might be somebody you ask one question too many. But Attorney Blackwell did a good job of really staying on the straight and narrow. And I would add, had the defense on cross open the door, John, had the defense on cross raised that particular report, they no longer would have had the benefit of saying, hey, well, you prejudiced us by even having this mentioned. So you saw even Attorney Eric Nelson sitting down very quickly because he did not want to lose whatever ground he would stand on in the event he wanted to later raise this on appeal.
It's one of the many remarkable moments throughout this trial, but in this final day of testimony, again, the defense has rested, the prosecution has rested. Closing arguments will be on Monday, the judge giving the jury a long weekend before they begin their very consequential deliberations. Laura Coates, Chief Ramsey, grateful, not just for your help and insights this morning, but throughout the past 14 days of testimony, and we'll be sure you'll be back with us on Monday. Up next for us, another dramatic case, and also in Minnesota, the former police officer who fatally shot Dante Wright today makes her first court appearance.
Hey there, CNN audio listeners. This is Dr. Sanjay Gupta, and I'm here with a new podcast called Chasing Life. As we're slowly starting to reemerge after this pandemic, I think it's time for a massive reset, a time to think about our physical and mental and emotional health. In Chasing Life, I'm going to talk to experts and colleagues about things like improving work-life balance, the true benefits of friendship, and how we might reimagine necessities like rest and spending quality time with our family and friends. If you want to spend a little time every week with me to focus on you, then check out Chasing Life. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts.
A major court appearance slated for this afternoon in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. That's the site of America's latest racial flashpoint. The former police officer, Kim Potter, makes her first court appearance before a judge. That hearing will be held virtually. Potter, a white woman, faces a second-degree manslaughter charge after she shot and killed 20-year-old Dante Wright, a black man, over the weekend in a traffic stop turned fatal encounter. Let's get straight out to Brooklyn Center. CNN's Adrian Broadus. Adrian, what are we told to expect in this hearing this afternoon?
Well, John, that hearing this afternoon, which will happen via Zoom, will likely be brief. The judge will read the criminal complaint against Potter, who has been charged with second-degree manslaughter. Here in the state of Minnesota, second-degree manslaughter carries a maximum sentence, if convicted, up to 10 years in prison or a $20,000 fine. Roles are reversing for the officer who spent a great deal of her career here at the Brooklyn Center Police Department. She started working here at the department back in 1995. The 48-year-old, according to the criminal complaint, was training a rookie officer on the day she fired that shot, a shot that ended the life of 20-year-old Dante Brown. The criminal complaint also tells us a BCA investigator examined the belt that carried Potter's gun and her taser. According to the complaint, she pulled the gun with her right hand, her 9mm handgun, and pointed it at Wright before firing one round. The yellow taser with the black grip was on the left side of that belt's holster. So the big question that a lot of people in the community have asked, how did she mistake the two? We will hear what happens in court today. She's going to be in court local time in a few hours. John?
Adrian brought us on the scene for us. Grateful for the live reporting. I know you'll stay on top of this case for us. Thank you, Adrian. And today, the Vice President, Kamala Harris, adding her voice to this ongoing conversation about policing. The body camera video in the case we just talked about there, you hear Officer Potter shouting, "Taser, taser, taser," before she discharges the gunshot that killed Dante Wright. In an interview Wednesday, the Vice President says she wants accountability in this case, as she puts the burden on police training.
Among the issues is the issue of training and having law enforcement who carry both be very clear about the difference between the two, because as we have seen, the consequence can be the loss of life. There has to be, among other things on this issue, serious training before someone is allowed to carry the two of those things.
Up next for us, major international news. The White House officially blames Russia's intelligence service for a massive cyber attack, and it imposes new sanctions as punishment. The Biden administration today slapping sweeping new sanctions on Russia, including expelling Russian officials stationed here in the United States. This a response both to the 2020 election interference from Moscow and the SolarWinds cyber attack that breached vital U.S. government agencies and private businesses. The move escalates tensions with Moscow, but the White House says President Biden is still hopeful to schedule a summit with Vladimir Putin sometime in the months ahead, later this year. Biden National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan telling CNN this morning the administration is adamant that Russia be held accountable, but he says there also is an opportunity here.
We believe that altogether, both the actions we are taking today and that broader diplomacy can produce a better set of outcomes for U.S.-Russia relations.
CNN's Kylie Atwood joins us now live from the State Department. An interesting perspective there, Kylie, that we're slapping some significant punishment, but we hope in the long run something better comes of it.
Yeah, that's right. The administration essentially is making the argument that their response today is proportional in response to what Russia had done, the malign actions that they had carried out that undermined the United States and Americans and America's allies. So I want to kind of work through the tremendous costs that have been inflicted on Russia by the Biden administration today. First of all, they sanctioned individuals and in the government and in intelligence agencies that were involved in that SolarWinds attack on U.S. government agencies and on private companies. They also went after individuals who were involved in the 2020 presidential interference efforts. The other thing that they did was expel 10 Russian diplomats. Those are folks that are essentially saying are spies of Russia. So they are kicking them out. They have to leave in 30 days. And then the third thing is that, with an executive order and with efforts by the Treasury Department, the Biden administration is going after Russian sovereign debt. That's a way to restrict Russia's economy. This is an important area, I want to point out, John, because this is an area where the Biden administration says that they can ramp up if they want to. In that executive order, there's room for Biden to do more down the line. Now, the question here, of course, with all of this is, what gives? Will this make an impact? Is this going to change Russia's actions? Officials told me that they're not sure that it will. But the bottom line is that the Biden administration is doubling down on its commitments to hold Russia accountable. And as you said, they're doing this alongside their efforts to try and maintain open communication with Russia. Russian President Vladimir Putin received a phone call from President Biden ahead of these actions that were taken today. And on that phone call, Biden warned him that they were coming. he also proposed that the two leaders sit down. And he said that because, the Biden administration is saying that we need to continue talking with Russia. The other aspect here I want to point out, John, is that the Biden administration is also saying that there are going to be unseen elements of their response to Russia. So not everything that we are seeing today is the totality of what they are doing in response to Russia's malign actions.
Right, and often in cases like this, those unseen elements are being blamed now for a cyber attack here in the United States. Well, I guess returning the favor, if you will. It's the wrong terminology, but it's likely one of the things that happens there. Kylie, stay with me for a minute, because our colleague, our chief White House correspondent, Caitlin Collins, just tweeting out that President Biden will speak to this at 4:30 later this afternoon. So 4 hours from now, we'll hear directly from the president. It is an interesting balance, and we're seeing it not only now in the case of Russia, but also in China. The climate envoy, former Secretary of State John Kerry, is talking to China about climate issues at a time the administration has some pretty strong policy differences with China. Can they do the same with Russia? Say that we disagree with this, we're going to sanction you about that, but can we cooperate on, say, arms control or other issues?
Important that this is their posture here. They're saying we're going to be tough, but we're going to be fair, essentially. We're going to hit back at you when it's necessary, but we're going to work with these countries who are adversarial to the United States when it's in the interest of the United States. And it's important to note that this climate change summit that's taking part next week virtually with world leaders, the Biden administration invited not only China, but Russia also to partake in that conversation. So the climate envoy, Secretary Kerry, is working on that as he is in China this week. And of course, we'll have to see which leaders show up to that effort and really take the opportunity to work with the United States in these areas where the Biden administration is saying, hey, we have overlapping interests, let's do something here.
85 days into the new administration, several international challenges front and center. Kylie Ashwood, grateful for the reporting and insights there. Let's focus on another one right now. The Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, is in Afghanistan today. That visit was unannounced, and it comes just one day after President Biden announced he will withdraw all U.S. troops from Afghanistan by the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks. This morning, Secretary Blinken saying after 2 decades, nearly 2 decades now, of U.S. troops on the ground in Afghanistan, the work ahead, no longer a military effort.
There is no military solution to the conflict that remains here. The only path forward to a durable, lasting, and just end to the conflict is through negotiation, is through a political agreement.
The president's plan is to begin drawing down those troops on May 1st, and that plan is getting mixed reactions from lawmakers up on Capitol Hill. Let's go straight up to Capitol Hill right now. Our chief congressional correspondent, Manu Raju. Manu, what is the fallout?
Yeah, actually mixed reaction from both parties. There's some on the Democratic side who are applauding what President Biden did. There are people like Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, who is supportive of what the move to withdraw troops from Afghanistan. There are also some Democratic critics like Jeanne Shaheen of New Hampshire criticizing the president. Also, Bob Menendez, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee chairman, raising concerns as well. And also the Republican side, overwhelmingly, there have been criticism from Republicans like Mitch McConnell, the Senate Republican leader, but there are also some support, like Senator Ted Cruz, who is behind the idea of bringing back troops from Afghanistan. But a sampling of the reaction here this morning on CNN, Jason Crow, who's a congressman from Colorado on the Democratic side, said that the folks left behind, nobody wants to be the last person out because that's a very dangerous place to be. We have to make sure that we're doing right by them. Now look at this. This is Senator Lindsey Graham, the Republican hawk from South Carolina, saying President Biden, unfortunately, has chosen the highest risk option available, which is to leave no matter what. And then Nancy Pelosi, the House Speaker, called it an important and welcome development. So you're seeing a mixed reaction on both sides. Just show the complicated legacy left behind on Capitol Hill from the nation's longest war. Some wanting to continue, some uncertain what it would bring, others worried, some still saying they're not certain if they'll get behind this, like one, Mitt Romney, the 2012 presidential nominee for the Republican side. I asked him if he backs this move. He said he'll wait and see what the conditions are on the ground when it is finally time to remove all troops. He said if it's safe then, he'll support it. If it's not, he will oppose it. John.
Manu Raju, live for us on the Hill. It is a remarkable conversation still, 20 years on. Manu, thanks so much for the live reporting. Up next for us, Dr. Anthony Fauci, also testifying on Capitol Hill today, defending his public health recommendations throughout the COVID crisis. The Johnson & Johnson COVID vaccine pause continues because government experts say they need more time to study some rare episodes of severe blood clots. A CDC committee looking at those safety concerns says it will reconvene in the days ahead, meaning that pause could last 7 to 10 days, perhaps more. Supplies of the J&J vaccine are low, but the pause still takes one of 3 U.S.-approved vaccines off the shelf at a time. Let's look at the numbers. The case count is stubbornly high. And you look at it right here, the Wednesday new infections, 75,375. Remember, when we head up to the horrific winter surge, we started at about 60,000 new infections a day. We're still at 71,000 is the average. 71,282 is your 7-day average of new COVID infections in the United States. Still a number way too high. This playing out, of course, just watch this. This is community transmission. You want to be yellow or blue. Watch the red, especially up here. It's community transmission over the past month, and you see filling in red, more red, more red. Especially in this part of the country, COVID cases running higher, community transmission still a problem. The hope is the vaccine rollout mitigate some of that, and 23% of the American population, 23% now fully vaccinated. 37% in the United States have received at least one dose. Among adults, those 18 and over, about half of the population, 48% have at least one dose, and nearly 2/3 of those over the age of 65, most vulnerable, 63% have been fully vaccinated of those 65 and over. So some progress in these numbers, even though the case counts are still very troubling. If you look at the vaccines by maker, Pfizer, Moderna, again, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine now on pause was already a smaller piece of the market. It was later to the market and has had some supply issues. Mostly Pfizer and Moderna in the marketplace right now. And if you look at the weekly allocations, especially with the J&J pause, it is up to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines to make up the gap, if you will. This is just for a first dose. But you see, back on the week of April 5th, 4.7 million and 3.5 million. April 12th, the next week, the same. The administration has been able to ramp it up a bit. A little more Pfizer, up to 5 million, a little more Moderna, up to 3.7. So this is more trying to boost the numbers of these two as J&J is off to the side for a little bit. As all this plays out, the administration having to explain its actions. Today, Dr. Anthony Fauci, among the administration witnesses on Capitol Hill, getting a little testy at times with Republican Congressman Jim Jordan.
What measure, what standard, what objective outcome do we have to reach before Americans get their liberty and freedoms back?
You know, you're indicating liberty and freedom. I look at it as a public health measure to prevent people from dying and going to the hospital. You're making this a personal thing, and it isn't.
It's not a personal thing.
No, you are. That is exactly what you're doing. We're not talking about liberties. We're talking about a pandemic that has killed 560,000 Americans.
That's
what we're talking about.
Our CNN senior medical correspondent Elizabeth Cohen is with us now. Elizabeth, I want to talk about the science and the data and the vaccine rollout, but there you see again evidence that we've seen throughout the past year plus of, let's just call it political disagreements, but it's more important than that.
It really is. I think what that exchange, that very heated exchange, John, shows us is the fight between sort of two different parts of America. Many Americans feeling the way Dr. Fauci does, which is we need to do what we can to save lives. You've got more than 500,000 dead Americans because of this virus. If you have to wear a mask to save lives, wear a mask, darn it. And darn it's my second choice of words. The other half of America saying, you're taking away my liberty by telling me to wear a mask or telling me that I shouldn't go here or shouldn't go there or that I shouldn't convene in large groups indoors. That exchange really crystallized that debate within the United States.
And as that debate continues, Elizabeth, the CDC and the FDA deciding to recommend the pause in the use of the J&J vaccine so they could, admittedly, a very rare, a small number of rare blood clots here, but some thought it would be a day or two. Now it looks like it's going to go on a little bit longer. Explain where we are.
So where we are is that they're proceeding very carefully with this. And so the government wants to get the recommendations from a group in the CDC. They're outside advisors who advise on vaccine decisions. They've been doing this for many, many decades. But yesterday, that group said, we want more data. And so they want to learn more before they make a decision. But at that same meeting yesterday, a CDC official said, by Friday, meaning tomorrow, by Friday, we need to set a date when we're going to talk again. My source is telling me there are basically two choices at this point. They say, look, this is going to go back on. They're not going to take this shot away. But what? Should they put out a warning saying, hey, if you want to take the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, you go ahead, but you got to know that there was this tiny, very rare number, a very small number of blood clots in the brain due to this vaccine. So take it if you want it, but we're warning you. Or do you do that and also say, you know what? Young women, you shouldn't get this vaccine because most of the events that we've seen are in that group, women under the age of 48. That's basically the two choices. This group wanted to see if there were maybe more cases of blood clots that hadn't come up before, but I think there's sort of a push now that these folks need to sit down and make a decision. Which of those two options are they going to take, or is there possibly a third one? John?
Well, I'm sure you'll stay on top of that, and you'll be back with us to talk about Elizabeth Cohen. Grateful for the reporting and insights there. A little global perspective now. Norway becoming the latest country to postpone introducing the Johnson & Johnson vaccine pending these ongoing investigations. Let's get more now from our CNN correspondents around the world.
I'm Melissa Bell in Paris. All eyes here in Europe very much on the European Medicines Agency and its expected verdict next week on the safety of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Many countries have paused its rollout. Here in France, the 200,000 doses already received, we're told, will be administered in the same way as the AstraZeneca vaccine is being administered in France. That is to people over the age of 55. But in many countries, we're waiting to see what the European Medicines Agency has to say about a vaccine that was to represent a substantial proportion of those deliveries that would be used for the rollout in many European countries. 200 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson are expected in the second quarter, with many countries relying on that to try and improve their vaccination rollout. Meanwhile, the President of the European Commission has said that the EU is negotiating for a third contract with Pfizer, which a Commission spokesman has described as the backbone of Europe's vaccination rollout program.
I'm Vedika Sood in New Delhi. India crossed two grim milestones Thursday. The country surpassed 14 million confirmed total cases of COVID-19. It also crossed 200,000 new daily cases for the first time since the pandemic began. The Health Ministry has also reported over 1,000 fatalities for the second consecutive day, the highest this year. Due to a continuing surge in cases and shortage of beds in hospitals, India's national capital region Delhi and financial capital Mumbai are now converting hotels into makeshift hospitals. A day after Delhi reported a record daily high, the Chief Minister Arvind Kejriwal has announced weekend curfews. Over the last week, several other states announced partial lockdowns. India has the second highest confirmed total cases of COVID-19 after the US, according to data from the Johns Hopkins University.
I'm Selena Wang in Tokyo. A key figure in Japan's ruling party said the Tokyo Olympics could be canceled this summer if Japan's COVID situation gets worse. It's rare to see a Japanese government official publicly address the topic of an Olympic cancellation. And Toshihiro Nikai is an extremely influential figure in Japanese politics. He was asked in a local TV interview if a cancellation of the Olympics was a possibility. He responded, of course, adding, what would be the point of an Olympics that spreads the infection? Now, that is exactly the question that many people here in Japan are asking. Hosting the Games this summer remains deeply unpopular among the public as Japan struggles to deal with a fourth wave of COVID cases that experts say are driven by more contagious COVID variants. On top of that, you have less than 0.5% of the Japanese population fully vaccinated. Now, we know that international spectators are banned, but these games will still involve more than 11,000 athletes from more than 200 countries who will be tested regularly but will not need to quarantine. Now, Nikai later watered down his comments, saying he hopes that the games go off successfully this summer, but his comments still struck a chord with the public.
Up next to us, some good economic news. The number of Americans filing first-time unemployment claims just hit a pandemic low. Topping our political radar today, jobless claims falling to the lowest level since the coronavirus pandemic first struck last spring. First-time unemployment claims fell to 576,000 last week. Now, that is still historically high, but it's down from 769,000 just the week before. Improving jobs numbers, along with a bigger-than-expected jump in retail sales, signaling the economic recovery is gaining steam. We're learning the Biden administration has flown more than 3,000 migrants, all families with children, from where they crossed the border in South Texas to San Diego, California, since mid-March, only to expel them to an area of Mexico those families are unfamiliar with. It's said to be an effort to ease the bottleneck in the Rio Grande Valley. Mexican officials say the migrants have been transported to shelters in Tijuana by Mexico's National Institute of Migration. House and Senate Democrats just introducing a bill to expand the Supreme Court from its current 9 justices to 13. That effort is being led by Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts, Representative Jerry Nadler of New York. The House Speaker Nancy Pelosi just asked moments ago if she would back this legislation.
Do you support Jerry Nadler's bill to expand the Supreme Court by 4 seats, and would you commit to bringing that bill to the floor?
No. I support the President's commission to study such a proposal.
The bill also unlikely to gain much momentum on the Senate side. All Republicans and several Democrats oppose expanding the court. Next hour on Capitol Hill, very important testimony. The U.S. Capitol Police Inspector General Michael Bolton expected to testify before a congressional committee about the intelligence and operational failures that led to the deadly January 6th insurrection. Let's bring in CNN's Whitney Wild, who's covering this story for us. What are we looking for?
Well, John, we're looking for details about the operational failures as well as the intelligence failures leading up to and on the day of the insurrection. So let's talk about the operational challenges they faced. The IG has pointed out that they had operational problems for months concerning their civil disturbance unit. That is the unit that would have been responsible for a riot. They did not have a standard operating procedure in place that had been rescinded in summer of 2020. They were supposed to come up with a new one. They never did. We might hear him talk about that. We will also very likely hear him talk about other operational challenges, such as failing to keep critical equipment in temperature-controlled settings. Now, on the day of the riot, operationally, more failures. Leadership apparently told some of the officers on the ground responding to this riot not to use their less-than-lethal options, things like stun grenades, things that may have arguably helped them control this crowd as this crisis was beginning to unfold. On the intelligence side, he points out that there was intelligence weeks before January 6th that indicated people on a pro-Trump website were talking about tunnels beneath Congress. That was in a piece of intelligence given from the Department of Homeland Security to USCP, apparently not acted upon appropriately. And further, one of the things he'll talk about is this confusion among USCP about what the intelligence said about the reality of the threat. Here is one of the quotes from his opening remarks. Certain officers believed USCP intelligence products indicated there may be threats, but did not identify anything specific, while other officials believed it would be inaccurate to state that there were no known specific threats to the joint session based on those same USCP intelligence products. A lot of conflict in the preparation of the intelligence products they were working from, what the product even said. And then as we look for ways to move forward, one of the things that he will talk about is reorienting this department from a police-based agency into a protection-based agency. That would represent a shift in their thinking about what their true mission is on the Hill. So that's something I believe he'll speak a lot about today, John.
More than 3 months later, still a lot of questions. Sometimes some more questions, actually. We haven't answered some of the existing questions, so we get more. Whitney Wild, grateful for the reporting. We'll stay on top of that story. Up next for us, we go to Chicago, where the city now bracing for the release of a police body camera video in the death of a 13-year-old boy. Live pictures here from Chicago. Any moment now, the mayor, Lori Lightfoot, will join other community leaders to hold a news conference, this coming ahead of the release of body camera video of Chicago police fatally shooting a 13-year-old. Adam Toledo was shot and killed in March by a police officer who chased him into an alley. Police claim the boy was carrying a gun. Let's get straight to CNN's Ryan Young in Chicago for us. Ryan?
Yeah, John, obviously this is a tough story. You think about a family having to lose a 13-year-old. Adam Toledo apparently had a gun in his hand. That's according to police. And an officer fired one shot that hit that young man in the chest. For weeks, there have been calls for the video to be released. We're told that video should be released today. What we do know is the family has had a chance to see this video. And in fact, they've watched it, and they even released a joint statement with the city, basically calling for calm. They want to make sure that his memory is not washed away with violence in the street. We know the city of Chicago has had a tough time dealing with some communities, especially when it comes to gun violence. What we know about 2 weeks ago, apparently a shot spotter heard some shots, and when police arrived, there was this 13-year-old with a 21-year-old, and apparently there was a run and a chase, and the cops ended up opening fire when they believe that young man turned around. We're hoping to get more of this video and get an idea of exactly what happened. But as of right now, you see sort of a joint situation going on between the family and the city to make sure there's calm in the streets. We'll be watching, of course, for the next few hours. John?
Grateful to hear for us, Ryan. Thank you so much, and thanks for joining us today. See you back here this time tomorrow. Ana Cabrera picks up our coverage right now.